All right, that's enough about that game. We ran real long on that one, but it's a worthy discussion. We haven't talked a lot about Texas A&M this year, and we want to give their fans their due on this show. So, staying in the West, let's talk about Auburn and Ole Miss for a second. We've talked a little bit already, and Auburn fans, if you're listening to this and you don't want to hear us gush about Alabama, we didn't really gush that much about Alabama in the Alabama Ole Miss game as much as we did talk about what we saw from Ole Miss in that game. So if you want a little more of a primer on Ole Miss, maybe check out the Alabama A&M preview that we've got up as well. So after the Mercer game, the rest of the world kind of left Auburn for dead. Even a lot of Auburn fans left Auburn and the Gus Bus for dead. And we have been saying all along that 14-6 to Clemson is not bad, especially on the road. And don't read too much into that Mercer loss. So I'm kind of saying that we've been on the Auburn bandwagon more than most, even when it wasn't cool. So let me ask you, let's lead off this discussion with this question. Is it true, or do you think it's fair to say that the nation overreacted negatively, too negative, on Auburn after the Mercer game following the Clemson game, and now there's a chance that maybe they're overreacting too positively after the Miss State and Missouri games?
Yes, and I know you said that to sort of set this up, but we talked about this last week, right? We did a preview on Auburn, Mississippi State, and we really repeatedly said you've got to take that Mercer game with a huge grain of salt, because what we care about in this show is trying to objectively, impassionately talk about our teams and talk about predictions, what they're going to do, and try to break them down in as much of a cold-hearted, cruel manner as I possibly can. Auburn's performance against Mercer was tough on the scoreboard, but it was actually really good statistically. They turned the ball over 5 times. And when you do that, yeah, you're going to not necessarily light up the scoreboard and things are going to look rough and people are going to go, oh my gosh, this is 24-10 win. But, they averaged 9.8 yards per attempt. Stidham was 32 of 37 passing through 364 yards. The only thing that was really concerning to me in that game was that Petway didn't run the ball particularly well, only averaging 3.8 yards per carry. They shut down Mercer offensively for almost the entire game. They just gave away some easy points with a fumble. And everybody got down on them off that game coming out of a Clemson game where, and we predicted that Clemson was going to win that game. And I think I had the model off, it's like 2 points off the final score or something like that. And it was basically coming from the fact that Auburn's offensive line needed a lot more time to gel. And frankly, they have a serious weakness at tackle. Every team has a weakness. Nobody's perfect in every area. And that's just kind of where Auburn's at. They'll find a way to shore it up. Every offensive line gets better later in the year, but they weren't ready to handle that front four from Clemson early on in the season. Auburn has shored those issues up to a large extent, but I think they're still there. The problem was Missouri is incompetent. Missouri is so bad that you can't take anything from them, because at this point, I'm not sold that Missouri can beat anyone. Missouri would probably lose to Troy, and not because it was a fluke, but because Troy was a better football team than Missouri. That's just where they at. That's what they are. And yeah, you can't read much from it. And likewise, Mississippi State, I don't really buy into Mississippi State because frankly, you can't look at star ratings, but their recruiting is crap. And if you're recruiting at a low level, you may have some guys like Leo Lewis, like Simmons, that can disrupt plays. But by and large, if you have the ability to get guys in space, and that's something Malzahn's very skilled at doing, you can just out-athlete them. And we've seen over and over again when Auburn plays teams that are slow or unathletic at like outside linebacker, when they play Kentucky's, when they want to step on the gas pedal, they put up 20 points in a hurry. That's what they did against Mississippi State. I think Mississippi State, right now, we're just beginning to really suspect that LSU may be that bad, and that's the only reason Mississippi State is considered as good as they were. But, again, way too much is made of a very difficult game against Clemson and a high turnover game against Mercer. Again, we had this long spiel, but the flip side of all that stuff was Mercer was a turnover game. Turnovers are not an indication of future action. Basically, fumbles are one of the less repeatable statistics in football. So the Mercer game, everything they did that's repeatable, the defensive stuff, Stidham's performance, they did fine. The next two games, they took care of business. I think the Mississippi State win was pretty impressive, but I think it was also somewhat expected. It was about what our model thought it would be. We thought that was going to be a blowout. So I think they're in the middle. I think they're a very good football team. I don't necessarily think they're unstoppable, but more importantly, I don't think they're a bad team that became a good one. I think they're a very good team that played an elite team and then played some really bad teams. And they're still a very good football team. And so to sort of finalize your point, I think Auburn is, ironically, to some extent, has a very good quarterback with maybe a better passing game than they do a run game to a certain extent. But they have an offensive line that is much more geared towards the run than the pass. So those two things are kind of in conflict, and it really depends on the defense's ability to generate a pass rush to expose the offensive line. And if they can't, then they can throw the ball. And if they do generate a pass rush, then Auburn has to rely more on the run game, which is the offensive line strength, and that's when their offense gets in trouble.
So the next question I have then is looking at Auburn's schedule, and we'll get into this game with this discussion and maybe, a little later, but looking at Auburn's schedule, even if we think Auburn is better than they really are, does it matter given who they have to play until November 11th when they face Georgia?
It's hard to say. We had this the same discussion with Texas A&M. They're really only two teams in the SEC West that are operating in a high ranked level, and that's Alabama and Auburn. And there's really only three. I think there's three top 15 teams in the SEC: Alabama, Auburn, and Georgia. I don't think there's another ranked team or ranked worthy team in the SEC. I think A&M is the closest, and that's it's hard to gauge that, but that's my guess, is that A&M's the next closest. A lot of people would probably think Florida. We maybe get into that a little bit with LSU Florida, but I think Florida is a mirage. So yeah, it's not that hard for for Auburn to just like A&M earlier, for Auburn to end up having a very good record. I think it's entirely conceivable that Auburn and A&M both finish 9-3 this year. I think Auburn's going to have a tough time beating Alabama because they're on a little bit of a different level. And I think Auburn is going to have a hard-fought game against Georgia. I don't really know who's the better team right now. I'm guessing it's about 50-50. But, Auburn may finish 10-2 or 9-3. A&M may finish 10-2 or 9-3. And then sort of the irony of that is A&M and Auburn may have the same record, but Auburn will have beaten A&M and probably be a significantly better football team than A&M. It's just the ceiling with Alabama is so high in Georgia, and they have basically probably three top 5 opponents right now on Auburn's schedule, and it's basically all top 5 opponents or unranked opponents. That's it. And so Auburn is probably capable of beating a lot of number 10 or number 15 or number 20 teams, but it's not going to show up anywhere because they don't play them.
What's crazy about that, and again, this is another comment that's away from this game specifically, but last year, Auburn's record was kind of playing above their abilities, and they rolled into a bowl game that I still think they could have won with a healthy quarterback, but their bowl game slot was probably a little over their head. But when you look at this Auburn team, who, let's say, theoretically does in the season with 3 losses, but they are the 3 top 5 teams, I could see them getting a bowl draw that's actually a good bit beneath them, that has the same 3-loss record but hasn't beaten any ranked teams. So that's an interesting sidebar, but let's get back to the discussion at hand, and that's Auburn and Ole Miss. We saw and we talked, like I said before, a lot about what we didn't like with Ole Miss, and we didn't see a whole lot that we did like. I do this to you some points throughout the year and kind of try to trip you up a little bit. Give me an area with this Ole Miss football team that could potentially give Auburn some trouble.
I think, maybe the most interesting question with Auburn in recent years is how good really is their pass defense. And right now, 4.8 yards per attempt they're giving up is phenomenal, right? And everybody, it's easy to laud that. Second best in the conference. It's better than Alabama. It's right with Georgia. They've given up only 4 touchdowns, have 4 interceptions, sub 100 quarterback rating. Great. But, and it's a big but, the only team they played that can pass is Clemson. Georgia Southern, averaging 5.6 yards per attempt. That's bad. Missouri, 6 yards per attempt. That's bad. Mississippi State, 5.1 yards per attempt. By the way, says slight sidebar there. Neither one of us really bought that Nick Fitzgerald was an elite quarterback. Nick Fitzgerald is probably not an elite quarterback, and right now his passing statistics, frankly, are pretty terrible. But to sort of put it in a perspective nationally, where does that 5.6 yard per attempt average rank? Pretty darn low. So if you're in like 5 yards per attempt, you're in 120th and worst category, okay? Versus FBS opponents only, filtering down. Yeah, Mississippi State is 123rd in yard per attempt average. Georgia Southern, a little bit better at 111th. Missouri, 102nd. So you've played one team in the top 100 in quarterback rating. That was Clemson. And Clemson isn't actually necessarily that good. They're only 41st nationally. They have their own issues passing the ball downfield. They're relying more on the run. So I don't know. And Bryant averaged a decent 6.2 yards per attempt in that game. I think there's an argument that Auburn's pass defense may not be quite as elite as people think. They're giving up, even though they only give up 4.9 yards per attempt, it's still 80% of opponent averages, which is what, 80% is the threshold, I think, for where we put like very good starts to get an elite range. Anything above 80% is good to very good. We want to see below 80% to really call you elite. And as good as Auburn's pass defense is, it is a little bit of a product of the offenses they've faced, and a little bit of that is still the fact that Clemson didn't really have their training wheels off yet as an offense. So I think there are actual questions about Auburn's pass defense. Their run defense, by the way, is a rock. 66% of opponent percentages allowed is fantastic, and the teams they play do like to run the ball a lot. But the pass defense is I won't say it's bad, and I don't want people to read from me to say that it's bad. You're asking for an exploitable part of the offense. Their pass defense is a question mark a little bit statistically because they haven't faced the kind of opponent that can really test them, and they haven't necessarily dominated compared to how their opponents normally do to the extent you'd guess, just because the opponents are so bad at throwing the football. Given that Ole Miss is a completely pass-happy team, that may be an area where Mississippi exposes them, to the extent that we have an area where we don't know how good Auburn really is. We have an area where we know Ole Miss is able to sometimes excel. That's an area where, okay, well, maybe it turns out Auburn isn't as good as we thought they were, and Ole Miss may win the game. But the truth of the matter is, if you take everything at face value and what we know, no, Auburn is a better football team in all 4 phases of the game. Rush and pass, offense and defense. Better team probably too on special teams, but yeah, there's no apparent weaknesses. That's just the one question mark that maybe is open for exploitation by the Ole Miss Rebels. Black Bears.
Yeah, and Land Sharks. They voted on it this week. Auburn fans, don't think we're killing your team. What we're trying to do is just kind of see if the numbers are telling any lies. And look, we've been high on your team all year. We were high on your team last year. We think some of the Gus chatter is a little ridiculous. So don't think we're killing your team. We're just trying to look at other areas, look at this game from different angles besides what we think the final score is going to be. Along the lines of sort of this progression we've seen with Auburn this year, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about Stidham and his performance relative to expectations and in the risk of pissing off Auburn fans even more. Have you seen anything that you don't like that might be hidden by good statistics?
Stidham has actually really good statistics the past few weeks, but he's also not thrown a ton of passes the past couple games, 17, 16 passes. But after the first 2 weeks of the season, he's thrown 75% or more in every game. He's thrown 9.8 yards per attempt or more in every game, which is a statistic we like. I think if I have some caveats, one, it's that he's not scoring a ton of touchdowns. they put up 51 points against Missouri, and he only threw one touchdown pass. 49 points against Mississippi State, only two touchdown passes. And what that kind of says is, to a certain extent, they are passing to complement the run, and they still aren't connecting at the breakaway shots that they probably should. And even with those, like the last game, he hit Hastings in a really good long ball, but Hastings was open by 25 yards on that touchdown pass.
That was an awesome route, by the way.
It was. Hastings is a completely different receiver from last year. It's a different sidebar, but last year he looked like a converted kicker. He didn't catch the ball worth a flip. He kind of got thrown around a lot in the short yardage game, and now we're starting to see why he's on the field, which is that his quickness is tough for a lot of teams. But a little bit of that, I think, was the Mississippi State secondary. We talked about that a lot last week in the Auburn Mississippi State preview, if you listen to it, that their secondary isn't very athletic, and we were really throwing up red flags in the Georgia and Auburn game because, man, their statistics were terrible last year. I don't buy that the secondary is that athletic. They're not. But where I'm still concerned with Stidham is he struggled when he was pressured. And Mississippi State doesn't really have the edge rushers necessary to pressure. Where they were excelling was guys like Simmons that could get an interior push. But even there, that was mostly against LSU that couldn't throw the ball. They didn't really get a push against Georgia, and they didn't against Auburn. And you're starting to wonder if maybe they just really we got a bad impression from them from playing teams that were a lot overhyped to begin the year. Again, nobody knew how good LSU was because they didn't really play anybody whatsoever to start the season. Likewise, Missouri's defense is at this point a wet paper bag. Mercer is still Mercer. I don't know how Stidham's going to handle it when they get edge pressure. And one of the things we're very careful on the show is not to draw too many conclusions when we don't have any data to indicate that a trend has changed or a problem has been fixed. I don't see anything in the past 3 games that's challenged their ability to pass protect on the edges, which means Stidham has not really been significantly pressured in a sense that he's got outside pressure from the pocket and he's forced to sit there and make a throw under duress and speed up his decision making. Until we see that, I don't know where he's at. And I don't know how well Ole Miss is really built to exploit it, but Haynes is a pretty solid pass rusher. And the front four is actually pretty darn disruptive for Ole Miss when they feel like showing up. So that is, to a certain extent, they probably are a little better than everybody Auburn's played since Clemson. And so that's something that I think is kind of a red flag. And that's, if Stidham's allowed to sit in the pocket and throw at a target without anybody making a move, he's awesome, right? I mean, in the pass skill competition, he's going to light it up. But he's a little worse when he has to think and when he has to speed up that decision-making process and set his feet. And I'm still not – we haven't had any evidence to show that that's changed.
All right, so all of that beating up on Auburn, and hopefully we still have a few Auburn fans still listening. I imagine all of these side stories and interesting anecdotes and looking at it from all these different angles to try to find something a little bit for Ole Miss isn't going to matter when we look at the numbers. So what does the computer model tell us in this? And let me know if you're surprised at all.
Right. We've already kind of gone over everything, which is Auburn's rush defense is excellent. Pass defense is very good. Ole Miss's rush defense, atrocious. 120% of opponent averages. Pass defense is 100% of opponent averages. And by the way, it should be better than that because opponent averages are inflated by bad opponents. What it basically comes down to is Auburn's expected to get 7.1 yards per play. And really, for the first game all year, honestly, really be able to control the game to a certain extent with the run game. And I say certain extent, a lot of people may think, well, that's not true, right? I mean, we ran for great yardage last week against Mississippi State. I'm going to kind of call shenanigans a little bit. Petway had 2.6 yards per carry outside his big run. And I know that still counts. I get that. But the point is 2.6 yards per carry, play in, play out, doesn't move the sticks. So Auburn has not been able to move the sticks successfully with the run game. They've been able to keep things honest enough for Stidham to move the sticks. I think this is a game where they probably can. But Ole Miss, the run game is going to be atrocious. The pass game still should be okay at 7.1 yards per attempt. you end up with a 7 yard per play average to a 4.5 yard per play average and a 39-4 final score. That said, and I know that's the next question you're going to ask me, I don't necessarily buy that score is as accurate as it should be for who these teams are.
Does this model tell you anything about these teams that, I don't know, that we can go on from the numbers, or are we still in kind of a gut scenario based on the lack of competition to this point?
It's a little bit of a gut scenario based off lack of competition. It's more than lack of competition, it's disparity. Auburn has played either an elite team or really bad teams. Mississippi State may not be really bad, we're not sure. Ole Miss has played an interesting sort of trifecta of really bad South Alabama, probably above average Cal, elite Alabama. So it's more of a stair step, and their statistics are actually a lot more reasonable because I have the data kind of encompasses how they do against elite teams and pretty good teams and bad teams. Auburn, we don't really know. We know they do badly against teams that are playoff worthy, and we know they do really good against teams that will struggle to make a bowl. It doesn't really tell us anything. Where this gets screwy, I think, is the fact that we talk about a lot. Models do a really poor job of predicting how run pass statistics are going to be balanced in a game depending on what works. Ole Miss is often underrepresented in this model because they don't attempt to run the ball. Ole Miss here is expected to get 4.5 yards per play because they have 1.9 yard per carry and 7.1 yard per attempt. Ole Miss is not going to run the ball 50% of the time. They're probably not going to run the ball 33% of the time. It's probably going to be less than that. So if you just took the 7 yards per attempt and just said, okay, let's assume they keep that but throw the ball every play, which isn't necessarily that far off, the score becomes 39-25, which is a heck of a lot closer than 39-4. So I think Auburn is going to put up a lot of points here. I don't see any sign that Ole Miss is going to be able to just stop them. But I also think Ole Miss's offense is going to be a little bit more effective. And it comes back to the thing we said earlier. Auburn's pass defense isn't necessarily shut down at this point. There's some signs it may be more of a question mark than people think. And depending on how that goes and how much Ole Miss can just throw the ball on every play, a little bit of that is how much the players have quit or not. That's a whole other sidebar that we don't even want to get into right now. Ole Miss has a chance to turn this into much more of a shootout. I don't think they're going to score 4 points. I do think it's going to be more, I'm going to guess something like 17 points. But you're still looking at something like a 41-17 final score where Auburn puts it away. Why did I waste all that hot air? Well, there's a big difference between 39-4 and 41-17. But I think it's 41-17 with a chance of being a shootout. And I say chance because I think there's a genuine question for how good Auburn's pass defense really is and how much they're able to shut down Ole Miss, assuming Ole Miss shows up to play, is going to show us a tremendous amount about whether Auburn's defense is a complete defense or whether it was a really good front four that can stop the run that hasn't been tested against the pass.
It's funny. The number I had in my head was 42-17. And one thing that I will give you and I both credit for on this show is, and we've talked about it a couple times this week or this year, is that we don't do the generic national analyst thing when we say, oh, well, you know, they might keep it close and win it in the end or blah, 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 just to make everybody happy. We generally predict blowouts when they're going to be blowouts, and they're blowouts. So I'm going 42-17, but the quit factor for me is scary because of what I saw from Ole Miss in the second half of that Alabama game. Now, when you're down, what was it, like 35-3 at the half, and they come out, bang, bang, touchdown again, I think that might break anybody's spirit. But unlike Vanderbilt, I'm not sure they recover. Vanderbilt, I think, has a lot to play for after that Bama loss, and I don't know what Ole Miss is playing for at this point this year. So that factor alone scares me a little bit in saying that you're picking 41-17, I'm picking 42-17. It could be worse. I'm not sure. I see a lot of ways it could be better. So having said all that, I still am a little frustrated because here we are this deep in the season, and Auburn's going to keep moving up in the rankings, and we still don't know that much about them. I do think they're a very disciplined defensive team, which I like, and that's one of the things that I don't think Georgia has yet. So when we're going to preview that game in a few weeks, that's one thing I like. I think their offense is coming along, but I still see a ton of shot plays, and I want to see move the chain plays. So I don't know there, but I do think Stidham is, as advertised, is really good. I would love, kind of like you said, you have both ends of the spectrum on Auburn's schedule, and you don't have anything in between. Maybe the A&M game can give us that. You got anything else on Auburn and Ole Miss?
Not particularly. I guess two things. One, a lot of Stidham's heat, in my opinion, and I've said this a bunch, I think it's due to the receivers. I think the receivers are young and they're getting better, but they're still not particularly good. And that's what really hurt them against Clemson, because they couldn't get open. And two, I don't think we're going to know who Auburn is, frankly, probably until the bowl. They're going to have a tough game against Georgia, and we won't really know where their ceiling's at. I think they probably lose to an Alabama team that's operating at an extremely high level. And we're not going to know till they're matched up in a bowl game, may well be a New Year's Six bowl, where they really stand against anybody that isn't a top 5 team.
All right, so that's going to do it for Auburn and Ole Miss. We've stayed in the West here for these two games. We're going to hop over the East in our other two for the podcast. Obviously, we break them up on YouTube. Just want to remind y'all, please give us a like if you love it, a thumbs down if you don't, but give us a comment and let us know why you don't love it. Also, score predictions in the comments. Please, want to hear it and talk about it with y'all to see what you think about this game.